The most valuable 800 acres of dirt on the planet were allegedly purchased for the price of a modern dinner for four, and that number, $24, has survived for nearly 2 centuries as one of the greatest deals or greatest thefts in human history, depending on who is telling the story. Peter Minuit, a merchant working for the Dutch West India Company, is said to have handed over trade goods for the island of Mannahatta in the year 1626, in what would become the borough of Manhattan, New York City. But the mystery that has never been fully resolved, the one this story will untangle piece by piece, is whether that transaction ever happened the way legend insists, what the Lenape people who lived there actually believed they were agreeing to, and how a swampy, marshy island of tidal creeks and oyster beds became, 4 centuries later, the most valuable real estate on Earth. To understand what was allegedly bought, you first have to understand what was already there, because Manhattan was not empty land waiting for a price tag. The Lenape and Algonquian-speaking people had lived across the region for thousands of years, before any European ship entered the harbor, moving seasonally between fishing camps along the rivers, cornfields in the interior, and shellfish beds along the shorelines that would later become the financial district and the Lower East Side. They called the island Mannahatta, a name whose exact translation is debated among linguists, though many scholars connect it to Island of Many Hills. The Lenape were not a single unified nation with one chief who could sign away territory on behalf of everyone. They were a network of bands and clans, matrilineal in structure, with leadership that was consultative rather than absolute. This detail matters enormously, because it is the seed of everything that went wrong in what followed. When Dutch colonists later claimed to have bought Manhattan, they were negotiating within a European legal framework of permanent, exclusive land ownership that had no real equivalent in Lenape custom, where land use rights were often shared, seasonal, and negotiated rather than sold outright. The Dutch arrival itself was not driven by curiosity or destiny, it was driven by beaver pelts. By the early 1600s, European hat fashion had created ferocious demand for felted beaver fur, and the forests of what is now upstate New York State were thick with the animal. The Dutch West India Company, chartered in 1621, was a private commercial enterprise, not a government in the way we think of one today, and it operated New Netherland as a business venture meant to produce profit for shareholders in Amsterdam. In 1624, the company established a small trading post on Governor's Island before shifting operations to the southern tip of Manhattan, choosing the location for the same reason it remains valuable today: deep, sheltered harbor access where the Hudson River meets the Atlantic, a natural choke point for trade moving in and out of the interior. Peter Minuit arrived in 1626 as the newly appointed Director General of New Netherland, sent by the company to organize and stabilize a colony that, until then, had been scattered, undermanned, and vulnerable. The most concrete piece of evidence historians actually possess about the purchase is not a deed, not a contract, not a treaty with named Lenape signatories. It is a single letter. On November 5, 1626, a Dutch merchant named Peter Schagen wrote home to the directors of the West India Company, reporting that the colonists have purchased the island Manhattan from the Indians for the value of 60 guilders. That letter is the entire documentary foundation of the most famous real estate transaction in American history. There is no bill of sale, there is no list of specific goods, there is no record of which Lenape leaders were present, what language was used to negotiate, or whether both sides walked away from that conversation believing the same thing had just occurred. So where did $24 come from? Not from the 17th century at all, but from the 19th. In 1846, a New York historian named Edwin Geod Burroughs, no more precisely, it was historian and antiquarian researcher who calculated a currency conversion, and later popularized through the work of historian John Roman Brodhead and others compiling early New York records, took Schagen's figure of 60 Dutch guilders and converted it into contemporary American currency, landing on approximately $24. That number was catchy, quotable, almost absurdly small, and it stuck in American folklore the way only a good punchline can. It became a staple of grade school textbooks, a shorthand joke about Dutch shrewdness and native naivety, repeated so often that most Americans today would swear it was an established fact rather than a 19th century estimate built on a single second-hand letter, with no itemized inventory behind it. Historians and economists have since tried to figure out what 60 guilders actually meant in real 17th century value, and the answer complicates the punchline considerably. 60 guilders was a meaningful sum of skilled labor at the time, roughly equivalent to what a Dutch craftsman might earn over several weeks of work. It was not a handful of glass beads tossed carelessly at gullible natives, as the folklore often implies. It likely represented a substantial bundle of trade goods, potentially including cloth, tools, kettles, and other manufactured items that held genuine practical value in Lenape economies, particularly metal tools that could not be produced locally. The worthless trinkets version of the story is largely a later embellishment, a flattering myth for European colonizers and a demeaning one for indigenous people. Useful because it lets everyone avoid a harder truth. This wasn't a swindle built on cheap junk. It was a genuine cross-cultural transaction where the two parties almost certainly understood the deal itself in fundamentally different terms. From the Dutch perspective, trained in European property law, the exchange of goods for land meant permanent, exclusive transfer of the territory. The Lenape sellers would no longer have rights to live on, hunt on, or use that land. From the Lenape perspective, rooted in a very different relationship to territory, the more likely understanding was an agreement to share use of the land, perhaps in exchange for goods and ongoing access to trade and protection, not a permanent surrender of all rights forever. This is not romantic guesswork, it is supported by what happened next. Dutch colonial records from the following years describe repeated tension over the presence of Lenape people continuing to fish, plant and travel through areas the Dutch believed they now owned outright. If the Lenape had understood the 1626 transaction the way Minuit's superiors in Amsterdam understood it, that friction would make little sense. The conflict over meaning was not an afterthought to the sale. It was baked into it from the very first exchange of goods on that riverbank. That friction did not stay quiet for long. Under Director General Willem Kieft, who arrived in 1638, Dutch relations with neighboring Lenape communities deteriorated into open violence. In February 1643, Dutch soldiers carried out a night attack on Lenape refugees encamped at Pavonia, across the river in what is now Jersey City, and at Corlier's Hook on Manhattan's east side, killing men, women and children in an atrocity that became known as Kieft's War. This was not an abstract land dispute playing out in courtrooms. It was colonists and indigenous families killing each other over exactly the ambiguity that had been left unresolved since 1626. The fighting dragged on for 2 years, devastated Lenape communities across the region, and nearly destroyed the fledgling Dutch colony itself through indigenous retaliation, proving that whatever had been bought on that riverbank had bought the Dutch nothing resembling lasting peace. Minuit himself did not stay to see any of this unfold. He was recalled to the Netherlands in 1631 amid disputes with the company over colonial management, and he later went to work for Sweden, helping found the rival colony of New Sweden along the Delaware River before dying in a hurricane in the Caribbean in 1638, a death with no connection at all to the island he is most remembered for acquiring. The man credited with the most famous deal in American history spent barely 5 years in the place, and by the time colonists were fighting and dying over what that deal actually meant, he was working for an entirely different European power an ocean away. Meanwhile, the settlement itself, New Amsterdam, was becoming something the Lenape sellers, whoever exactly they were, could never have anticipated. Enslaved Africans were brought to the colony as early as 1626, the same year as the alleged purchase, making Manhattan's economy entangled with slavery from its very first Dutch year, decades before England ever took control. By the 1640s, New Amsterdam had grown into a remarkably diverse trading post, with historical records describing as many as 18 languages spoken on its muddy streets, a diversity that would become, centuries later, one of the defining features of the entire city built on that ground. A defensive wall was constructed across the northern edge of the settlement in 1653, running along the path that is today Wall Street, built not to enclose wealth but to keep out English colonists and indigenous raiders, a detail almost nobody remembers when they hear the street's name today. The Dutch chapter of Manhattan's story ended not through negotiation but through naked imperial pressure. In 1664, English warships under Colonel Richard Nicolls sailed into the harbor and demanded the colony's surrender. Peter Stuyvesant, the last Dutch Director General, wanted to fight. The colonists, tired and outnumbered, refused to back him, and New Amsterdam surrendered without a shot being fired. The English renamed the colony New York, after James, Duke of York, brother to King Charles II, the same royal title that gives the entire state its name today, a distinction worth holding on to, because the colony of New York and the city of New York would develop very different identities over the coming centuries, one becoming an enormous agricultural and industrial hinterland, the other becoming a hyper-dense global trading capital squeezed onto a narrow island. The Dutch briefly recaptured the city in 1673 during a subsequent war, renaming it New Orange before ceding it back to England permanently in 1674 under the Treaty of Westminster. Dutch names, however, refused to disappear. Breedweg became Broadway, Bouwryk became the Bowery, and the family names of Dutch merchant clans like the Roosevelts and the Van Cortlandts would echo through New York politics and geography for the next 300 years. What no one in 1626, Dutch or Lenape, could have possibly foreseen was that the specific geography of this island, its deep natural harbor, its position at the mouth of a river system draining deep into the American interior, its narrow bedrock spine perfect for supporting heavy construction, would make it uniquely suited to become the financial engine of an entire future nation. The value of Manhattan real estate was never really about the dirt itself. It was about location relative to trade routes, and as American commerce expanded westward through the 1700s and 1800s, Manhattan's harbor access became almost irreplaceable. The completion of the Erie Canal in 1825, connecting the Hudson River to the Great Lakes, transformed New York City into the primary gateway for goods moving between the American interior and international markets, and property values on the island began a climb that has, with a handful of dramatic interruptions, never really stopped since. That climb required space, and space required a plan. In 1811, the Commissioner's Plan imposed a rigid grid of numbered streets and avenues across most of Manhattan, north of what was then the settled city, a decision made by state-appointed commissioners with almost no input from residents who would eventually live within it. The grid was explicitly designed to maximize the efficient sale and development of land parcels, commerce dictating urban geometry from the very start, echoing the same commercial logic that had driven Dutch colonization 2 centuries earlier. Manhattan's shape was never neutral. It was engineered, over and over again, for buying, selling, and building. Nowhere is that engineering more visible or more brutal in its human cost than in the creation of Central Park. Beginning in 1853, the state legislature authorized the city to acquire roughly 700 acres in the center of the island for a great public park, and construction proceeded through the late 1850s under designers Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux. But that land was not empty before the shovels arrived. It was home to Seneca Village, a community of roughly 225 residents established in 1825, predominantly African-American property owners, along with Irish and German immigrant families, complete with 3 churches and a school. Seneca Village was destroyed through eminent domain, its residents displaced and largely uncompensated at anything resembling fair value, its very existence nearly erased from public memory until archaeological and historical research, beginning in the 1990s, brought it back into public consciousness. The pattern established in 1626, land use decided by outside authority, displaced communities left with grievances the historical record barely preserved, repeated itself in the heart of Manhattan more than 2 centuries later, dressed in the language of civic improvement rather than colonial trade. The 19th century also brought waves of immigration that reshaped the island's density and its politics simultaneously. Irish immigrants fleeing famine arrived by the hundreds of thousands starting in the late 1840s, crowding into lower Manhattan tenements in neighborhoods like the Five Points, an area notorious for poverty, disease, and violence, later immortalized in exaggerated form by popular history and film, but grounded in very real overcrowding and gang conflict documented by city health inspectors and reformers like Jacob Riis. German immigrants settled heavily on the Lower East Side in an area nicknamed Kleindeutschland. Later in the century, Eastern European Jewish immigrants and Italian immigrants poured into those same streets, and by 1900 the Lower East Side was one of the most densely populated urban areas on the planet, with some blocks housing more than 700 people per acre. Tenement buildings, often just 25 feet wide and 100 feet deep, packed multiple families into apartments with little ventilation or plumbing, prompting reform legislation like the Tenement House Act of 1901, which set new requirements for light, air, and sanitation in New York City housing, rules that fundamentally altered how Manhattan's buildings were designed going forward. This same immigrant labor force built the fortunes and the buildings that made Manhattan real estate worth fighting over, and that labor came at a terrible cost that the island's rising land values rarely reflected. On March 25, 1911, a fire broke out at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory near Washington Square, killing 146 workers, most of them young immigrant women, many of whom died because factory owners had locked exit doors to prevent unauthorized breaks and theft. The disaster triggered sweeping labor and fire safety reforms across New York State, reshaping building codes that still govern construction on the island today. The story of Manhattan's value was never only a story of finance. It was written in factory floors, sweatshops, and the bodies of workers whose names rarely appear on the deeds of the buildings their labor made profitable. Meanwhile, political power over Manhattan's land and money was consolidating in the hands of Tammany Hall, the democratic political machine that dominated city government for much of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Figures like William Boss Tweed extracted enormous sums through padded construction contracts. The Tweed Courthouse on Chambers Street, begun in 1861, was originally budgeted at around $250,000 and ultimately cost the city an estimated $12 million to $13 million by the time Tweed's corruption was exposed in 1871, a scandal that became a national symbol of municipal graft. Tammany's power rested on controlling patronage, city contracts, and crucially, land use decisions: who got permits, who got contracts, whose neighborhood got infrastructure, and who's got neglected. The connections between political power and Manhattan property were never coincidental. They were the mechanism by which the island's soaring value got distributed and who got left out. The physical transformation of the island accelerated dramatically after the Civil War, driven by an engineering innovation as consequential as the original Dutch harbor itself, the skyscraper, Manhattan's bedrock, that same dense Manhattan schist that had made the island geologically stable enough to interest Dutch traders, turned out to be uniquely capable of supporting extraordinarily tall buildings. The development of steel frame construction and the safety elevator, patented by Elisha Otis in 1861 and first installed commercially in a New York City building in 1857 for the Hallwart Building, made vertical density possible in ways that transformed how much profit could be extracted from a single parcel of land. Every additional floor added to a building on a fixed lot multiplied its earning potential without requiring a single additional square foot of that impossibly scarce original resource, land. Manhattan solved its space problem not by finding more land but by stacking it, floor after floor, into the sky. By the 1920s, a fevered competition to build the world's tallest building gripped the city, culminating in the race between 40 Wall Street, the Chrysler Building, and the Empire State Building. The Chrysler Building, completed in 1930, briefly held the title at 1,046 feet before the Empire State Building surpassed it in 1931, rising to 1,250 feet and completed in a stunningly fast 410 days despite opening into the teeth of the Great Depression when it struggled for years to find enough tenants and was mockingly nicknamed the Empty State Building. That detail alone should complicate any simple story about Manhattan real estate as a guaranteed, ever-rising fortune. The 1929 stock market crash, centered financially on the trading floors of Wall Street just blocks from where Peter Minuit had allegedly closed his deal 3 centuries earlier, wiped out enormous paper wealth almost overnight and triggered building vacancies and foreclosures across the island through the 1930s. Manhattan land values have never moved in a straight line upward. They have moved in violent cycles, shaped as much by financial panic and policy as by any inherent unchanging value of the ground itself. The 20th century also brought Robert Moses, whose decades of influence over New York City's infrastructure, beginning in earnest in the 1930s and continuing into the 1960s, reshaped the entire metropolitan region, not just Manhattan but all 5 boroughs simultaneously. Moses built highways, bridges, and housing projects with almost unchecked authority, often bulldozing existing working-class and minority neighborhoods to do it. His 1959 to 1960s battle over a proposed expressway through Greenwich Village and later through Soho and Little Italy was ultimately stopped by grassroots opposition, led by figures like the writer and activist Jane Jacobs, whose 1961 book The Death and Life of Great American Cities directly challenged Moses's vision of urban renewal and became foundational to modern urban planning theory. That fight, decided in Manhattan community board meetings and city hearings through the mid-1960s, determined which neighborhoods would survive intact and which would be erased, another chapter in the island's long history of contested authority over who gets to decide what happens to its ground. It's worth pausing to be precise here about geography and government, because the story of Manhattan easily gets tangled with the story of New York City as a whole, and the two are not the same thing. Manhattan is one of 5 boroughs that make up New York City, alongside Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, and Staten Island, a consolidation that only occurred in 1898 when these separate municipalities and counties were merged into a single city government. Before 1898, Brooklyn was its own major independent city, at the time the 4th largest city in the United States, in its own right. And New York City itself is entirely distinct from New York State, whose capital sits in Albany, roughly 150 miles north, governed by a legislature and governor with authority the city government does not have, particularly over matters like housing law, transit funding, and criminal justice policy that constantly create friction between city officials and state lawmakers. When people say Manhattan was bought in 1626, they are talking about a transaction that predates the city, predates the state government as it exists today, and predates the very borough boundaries that now divide the region administratively. The island's value was never contained by any of those later political lines. It simply became the seed around which they all eventually formed. By the mid-20th century, Manhattan's economic gravity had made it one of the most expensive places to build, live, and do business on the planet, and that concentrated value attracted both extraordinary investment and extraordinary crime. The 1970s brought a genuine fiscal crisis to New York City, with the city nearly defaulting on its debt in 1975, prompting the state to create the Municipal Assistance Corporation to help manage finances, and famously prompting President Gerald Ford's administration to initially refuse a federal bailout, immortalized by the New York Daily News headline, "Ford to City, Drop Dead," even though Ford never used those exact words himself. Crime rates climbed through the 1970s and 1980s, with the city recording over 2,200 murders in 1990 alone, a period when large sections of Manhattan, including parts of Times Square and the Lower East Side, were considered dangerous and undesirable, driving property values down in ways that seem almost unimaginable given the neighborhood's later transformation into some of the most expensive commercial real estate on the planet. That transformation, beginning in the 1990s under mayors Rudy Giuliani and later Michael Bloomberg, involved aggressive policing strategies, tax incentives for redevelopment, and a broader national trend of urban revitalization that dramatically increased Manhattan property values through the 1990s and 2000s. Times Square itself, once dominated by adult theaters and drug trade, was redeveloped through public-private partnerships into a corporate tourist destination anchored by companies like Disney, whose 1994 investment in restoring the New Amsterdam Theater became a symbol of the neighborhood's rebranding. Land that had been nearly worthless by commercial standards a generation earlier became some of the priciest advertising real estate in the world. Its enormous illuminated billboards now leased for tens of millions of dollars annually. Then came September 11, 2001, when terrorist attacks destroyed the World Trade Center's Twin Towers in Lower Manhattan, killing 2,753 people at the site and devastating a 16-acre area at the heart of the city's financial district. The economic and psychological shock rippled through Manhattan real estate immediately, with office vacancy rates spiking and questions raised nationally about whether dense urban skyscraper construction itself remained a wise investment. Yet within a decade, the rebuilding of the site, including the completion of One World Trade Center in 2014 at a cost exceeding $3.9 billion, demonstrated something remarkable about this particular island's economic resilience. Catastrophic destruction did not permanently diminish demand for its ground. If anything, Lower Manhattan property values recovered and then substantially exceeded their pre-2001 levels within roughly 15 years. An almost eerie echo of the island's entire history, repeated disaster, repeated displacement, repeated destruction, and yet an almost stubborn continuation of rising value built directly on top of whatever came before. Today, estimates of Manhattan's total real estate value run into the trillions of dollars, with individual apartments in buildings like 220 Central Park South selling for over $100 million, and average per-square-foot prices in prime districts exceeding what most Americans pay annually in total housing costs. Compare that valuation to the 60 guilders Peter Schagen described in A Letter Home in 1626, later converted by a 19th-century historian into the tidy sum of $24, and the gap becomes almost impossible to comprehend rationally, until you remember that the comparison itself was always a kind of trick, a flattening of centuries of forced labor, land speculation, political corruption, immigrant sweat, financial engineering, catastrophic loss, and repeated reconstruction into one convenient punchline about Dutch cunning and native gullibility. The truth resists that punchline at every turn. The Lenape who negotiated with Peter Minuit's colonists in 1626 almost certainly did not believe they were permanently surrendering their homeland for pocket change. They were likely engaging in what they understood as a reciprocal arrangement rooted in shared land use, an arrangement the Dutch colonial system was never going to honor as anything other than absolute, permanent, exclusive ownership. Within 17 years, that unresolved gap in understanding erupted into massacre at Pavonia. Within a generation, the Dutch themselves lost the island to English conquest without firing a shot in its defense. Within 2 centuries, the island's indigenous displacement had been repeated on black and immigrant communities inside Seneca village to build a park celebrated as an urban Eden. Within 3 centuries, immigrant laborers died behind locked factory doors while the buildings and fortunes their work sustained kept climbing in value above them. And within 4 centuries, land that Dutch traders once measured in fur pelts and trade cloth had become a battleground for $100 million penthouse sales, contested zoning fights, and a housing affordability crisis that continues to push working-class residents out of a borough they can no longer afford to live in. Perhaps that is the real inheritance of 1626, more than any specific sum of money. Manhattan has never simply held value. It has generated conflict over who controls that value and who gets displaced in the process. A pattern set in motion the moment 2 fundamentally different understandings of land ownership collided on that riverbank and were never actually reconciled, only overwritten by whichever power held the most force at any given moment. The $24 legend survives not because it's accurate, but because it's comforting. It turns 4 centuries of contested, often violent history into a simple joke about a good bargain. The real history of how this island changed hands and kept changing hands again and again through war, fire, financial collapse, political machine corruption, and forced displacement is far less tidy and far more revealing about how value gets created in cities, not through fair exchange, but through whoever manages to write the terms of the deal and whoever is left afterward to argue about what those terms actually meant.